Good afternoon. We have very impressive legal talent on this panel, as well as the Governor of Rhode Island. So first, let me welcome Governor Raimondo of Rhode Island, Dean of Stanford Law School, Jenny Martinez, and Professor Robin Walker-Sterling, Director of the Bluhm Legal Clinic of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Welcome all of you. I'm Leslie Cockburn, former journalist, Ferris Professor Emeritus at Princeton, and the Penal Team Democratic nominee of the 5th District of Virginia. So what we're talking about today is saving democracy. In fact, all of us have been obsessing on the threats to our democracy, so we really want to address some of the ways we actually do something to save it. I would like to remind everyone that in our long history in this country, we have been tested many, many times. First of all, we had the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, permitting imprisonment or deportation of non-citizens, of anyone deemed to be a threat, or a publisher of anything false, scandalous, or malicious in their writing. I certainly would have been in jail. We had many acts and laws that promoted slavery. We had the Fugitive Slave Act, which was particularly pernicious. In 1917, women were actually clubbed, beaten, and tortured for seeking the vote, for picketing in front of the White House. And then we also had the Espionage Act. Imagine how that would affect Black Lives Matter. Governor Raimondo of Rhode Island, I want to address this to you first. Looking at the looming threat of voter suppression coming up this fall, what can be done at the state level to stop it?
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for having me. It's nice to see you virtually. I wish we could be doing this in person, but I'm glad that we're together. I think I had a little trouble hearing you, but I think the question is, what can we do to prevent voter suppression? And
yes.
First, let me say this. First, we have to recognize that it's a very real threat and a real issue. And for anyone who thinks that we do have equal and unfettered access to the ballot box, it's not true. And I say that sincerely, which is we have to be serious that this is real. Whether that's gerrymandering laws. By the way, a governor is the only one in the state who can veto an overly jerry-rigged map. So if you want to know if states matter, the answer is yes. Whether that's, laws that make it harder for people on college campuses to vote because young people might disadvantage a particular party. Whether that, there are different laws, state laws, by the way, designed to make it harder for people of color to vote, poor folks to vote, formerly incarcerated people to vote. The list goes on and on. Most of this battle actually takes place in states through state law, state leadership, state board of canvassers, state boards of elections. So I would say recently, a few days ago, I was on a panel around climate change, and people are asking me, what's the one thing you could do? My answer is the one thing that we can do to deal with all of these issues is to vote. Because leadership matters. So it matters who's in your state legislature, because they're the ones doing the jerry-rigging the maps. They're the ones passing these horrible voter suppression rules. And it also matters who's in office as a governor, who can either put forth just legislation, as we have done, to make it easier for formerly incarcerated folks to vote, or who can veto unjust legislation. So bottom line is, realize it's a real threat, today. This isn't something to read about from the 50s and 60s in history books. It's today. It's real. The fight is real. And it's in many ways being waged in states as much as in the United States Congress.
Well, let me just ask you to follow on that. There's a whole movement now to get people to vote in person because of all of these questions about the mail, to go early voting in person. What do you think about that?
I'm in favor of early voting, but I think we need to do more to allow mail-in ballots. Look, this whole, my view is, and I'll try not to be partisan here, but the whole argument that we have massive amounts of voter fraud, which is why you need voter identification at the ballot, which is why folks have to go in person. There's actually no evidence of that. So, like here in Rhode Island, for example, we have a law that requires you to have a valid ID to vote. Now, I don't support that. I don't think it's necessary. You shouldn't have to have your license to do it. And it's purely designed to block people's access to vote. A couple of years ago, I put through legislation for automatic voter registration. You should be automatically enrolled to vote when you get your license. So my view is we need to be taking these small, important steps to make it easier for people to vote, including by mail, to answer your question, including early, to make it easier to register. And there are plenty of ways for us to protect against fraud, to the extent that there is any, without denying, making it harder for people to actually cast their valid ballot.
Okay, does anyone else want to weigh in on this? All right, let me ask you, Dean Martinez, I want to ask you specifically, we're hearing in Washington, we're hearing that there will be legions of lawyers gearing up the legal challenges to the election results. What will they do, and how can they ensure that we have a fair election?
So, as I understand it, the question is about litigation around the election. And I think that it is very important in this election, as in all elections, that we follow our longstanding practices, which include respect for existing laws and the process by which claims are resolved when there is a dispute. And there are signs that there will be many potential legal disputes coming out of the election. Stanford and MIT are running a nonpartisan project called the Healthy Elections Project. And one of the things that we have on the website there at healthyelections.org is a litigation tracker that shows already all of the litigation that is proceeding in different states about various election rules and procedures. And if you go to it, you'll see there are already quite a number of cases that are pending in various courts about various rules of state law regarding elections, of course, federal issues with respect to people's right to vote, and so forth. And I think one of the important rules that lawyers have, of course, is protecting individuals' right to vote and making sure that all of the votes are counted and that people are not denied access to the ballot box or denied the right to have their vote counted based on some attempt to skew the results or exclude votes that could be very problematic, because there, as the governor said, there are very few cases of voter fraud, for example, with vote by mail. It is not actually a substantial problem. And if you look at historical records on that, and so of course we want careful adherence to legal procedures, but we don't want to see a situation in which thousands of legitimate, valid votes are discarded, and the legal system should be there to protect those votes.
Well, let me ask this, talking about the courts brings us, of course, to the most important recent event, which is the death of Justice Ginsburg. And I want to ask Professor Walker Sterling, if the court goes 6-3 with a Trump appointee, what is at stake? I mean, what does it mean to live in a post-Justice Ginsburg world?
Thank you for that question. And I'll just let everybody know that there's a slight lag in my camera. So I hope that doesn't seem, it's not coming across as too sort of weird or disjointed. So it's a great question because it's really only relatively recently that the High Court had assumed a position as a champion of civil rights and civil liberties, right? That really happened when Earl Warren was Chief Justice and affected what folks call his due process revolution that introduced a lot of the due process protections in criminal court, that struck down piece by piece the intricate legal lattice work that Jim Crow was built upon. That's really sort of a relatively new happening in the life of the court. And just by way of to give people an idea of how important that was, when I was growing up in a group of the South Bronx, and we lived in this apartment that had this long hallway. And in the hallway, we had pictures of 3 political figures. All the other pictures in our home were of our family. We had pictures of 3 political figures. One was a picture of President Kennedy. One was a picture of Dr. King. And the third one was a picture of Earl Warren, right? Like that's the kind of stature that he had in terms of the efforts he made on behalf of civil rights, right? And I mean, imagine, like, I don't know anybody, for example, who has pictures of Chief Justice Roberts up in their home. Maybe, maybe I just haven't visited enough people's homes, but right. But that's just it's a different kind of reliance and intimacy with federal law, with the Supreme Court than we had previously known, I think. And so Justice Ginsburg's role in that is very much sort of in that tradition, right? She became this icon, this feminist icon. With people had her on T-shirts and dressed up as her for Halloween, right? It's a different level of appreciation for the kind of difficult and careful intellectual work that it takes to configure our country's founding principles in a way that lives up to what they promise. Right? So a 6-3 court sort of going backwards, and well, that's how I feel about it. So that's what I'm going to say. So going backwards would it will feel like a retrenchment to us, but in the history of the court, it actually won't be. It'll be sort of more like resumption of business as usual, I think, in sort of in terms of the court's history. And we're looking at potential rollbacks in a lot of the really important issues of the day, right? All of the sort of big ticket issues: abortion, affirmative action, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, right? Like those are basically everything would be on the table to be reevaluated, or at least rechanneled in perhaps a different direction.
Okay. I mean, there's talk right now of possibly adding new justices because the numbers have not been the same throughout the history of the country. What do you think of that idea?
So I actually don't have any problem with it. I think that having a much larger court would give advantages in lots of ways. So, for example, there'd be room for representation of a wider range of racial and ethnic demographics than I think there seems to be now. And I also think that we wouldn't be in this situation where, one person dies and the entire country feels like it's sort of like convulsing in a constitutional crisis, right? Like that is, there's something faulty with that happening. So, and there are a lot of circuit courts that operate this way, right? There are 20 or some odd so circuit court justices, and I'm sorry, judges, and they you pull a panel when it's your time to argue, and people sort of rotate in and rotate out. And in addition, a bigger number of justices would also allow the court to, I think, expand its docket. The Supreme Court's docket has shrunk considerably in the last few decades, and that also contributes to why everything seems so high stakes, right? And so, if there are more justices, that it perhaps expands the court's capacity to take more cases and rule decisively on more points of law.
Okay, so let me ask Governor Raimondo, given the protests in the streets right now, the heightened awareness of racial injustice, and the fact that our democracy has not been for all, what concrete steps should be taken by the next administration to address this in the first year?
A good question. It's a complicated question, and there is no one thing. I would say at the root of so much of this unrest is the reality of a total lack of opportunity by too many Americans to get ahead, and a sustained structural inequality on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of immigration status that has existed since our country's founding and that exists today. So I would say the first step to healing is an honest reckoning with inequalities that exist, an honest reckoning. So as it relates to race, an honest reckoning, which is to say, we didn't wake up a month or two ago to an isolated incident of George Floyd. Slavery led to no real reparations or reconstruction, led to Jim Crow, led, on, and it's just an unending, unabated, uninterrupted string of racism in our criminal justice system, in our education system, in our economy. My family were immigrants, but they were allowed to join a union, so they got ahead. Black folks were left out of that institution. So across our institutions and our laws and in our economy, unabated, we got to have an honest reckoning with that. A similar but different argument could be made about women. So my point is, number one, it's time for, just let's be real about it and honest about it. Let's not sugarcoat. Let's not pretend it's new. Let's not pretend we've ever done anything serious. I, for one, am happy to hear that reparations is kind of a, almost mainstream concept that people are open to. Secondly, as I said before, I think the root of the anger is just this deep inequality. Lack of access to housing, lack of access to education, disparate access and lack of access to health care, lack of access to decent jobs and high-paying jobs, or disparate access to those high-paying jobs or decent jobs, inequality throughout the criminal justice system. We just talked about the lack of access to equal access to the voting booth. So I think it's time for like number one, a reckoning. And then number two, there's like a deep-seated commitment to equality or equal access to opportunity across a number, not just criminal justice reform, housing, healthcare, income, education, college affordability, the whole thing. It's a big, bold agenda, but I'll tell you this, until we get to the business of providing a more equal opportunity, our democracy is in peril.
Okay.
Anger you see in my state too, the looting, the anger, the protests, it's not going away because it's real anger rooted in real inequality. So until we will not be able to have a more perfect union and a more real democracy, until we get to the business of getting rid of the income and educational inequality that plagues our country.
Let me just ask a question of whether, something that I learned about recently that I find extraordinary, which is if the police kill a Black man or a Black woman, if there's a case, if there's a settlement, it's not the officer who pays, and it's not the police department that pays, it's the taxpayer that pays in these towns and cities. You know, you have bonds issued. We need police accountability in order to have a democracy. Who would like to address that? Professor Walker-Sterling, do you talk about this in your clinic?
I do. First, I wanted to co-sign Governor Raimondo's comment just now about there needs to be some sort of real process of truth seeking and reconciliation. I wish I could show you, if I could show you my notes for today's talk, that's sort of the biggest thing that I wanted to get across. And so I'm so glad that you've raised it. But with respect to, so that looking at this question of police accountability certainly is compelling. And for me, I am still reeling in the wake of the charges and lack of charges concerning the murder of Breonna Taylor. And just to take a moment to talk a little bit about that, as an African-American woman who is a citizen of this country, the charges in that case of where the officer was charged with, one officer was charged with endangering the lives of other people, of endangering the lives of the people in neighboring homes, right? That charge says to me that the officer was charged for the bullets that missed her body and not the ones that killed her, right? I cannot describe to you how chilling that is, because that woman was just asleep in her bed. And there was error after error after error that resulted in her being shot and killed. And there is no one taking responsibility for it, right? Her mother made a statement. She said, I can't, it's hard to breathe without her, right? And it makes me think of all the ways, and this is again looping back to the earlier comment, all the ways that Black people in this country can't breathe, right? Like, so that the discussion about police accountability is a small part of the larger issue, which is the very consistent and clear, I want to say like sort of undermining, but worse than undermining opportunity, of equal opportunity for everyone, right? Because we're kind of gaslit into believing that we all have equal chances when we just don't, right? We just don't. And that's just true. And I know that what's at stake in a real conversation about that, right, is that people start to challenge you. Well, so don't you believe in meritocracy, and don't you believe in this, and don't you believe in that? I don't know. I personally think that, like, you can't possibly believe in meritocracy, right? If you are at all, if your eyes are at all open, right? Like you're telling me that that there wasn't a single woman in this entire country who would have made a better president than, like, Warren G. Harding, right? You know what I mean? Like I don't think that there are, right? Like, there are too many obvious and blatant examples where instead of elevating meritocracy, what we elevate is opportunity, because opportunity is what we can squelch, right? Ability, and ability that's not nurtured by opportunity dies on the vine. And so, and in particular, sort of in contrast with my own lived experience, where, right, like, I'm a Black woman, my family's Black, I grew up in Black household, I grew up in the South Bronx, right? There are, right, like, I'm unusual in that I ended up at Yale and went to these fancy schools, and now I have this job that I love, and that I have this opportunity to be an educator. But I'm only unusual because I had that path. I'm not unusual in terms of my ability, right? Like, there were tons and tons of other kids at my school in the South Bronx who were just as smart, just as talented, just as driven, and didn't have these chances. And so again, moving back to the police accountability question, it's a small part of the question. Certainly, I mean, I think that having officers responsible for paying judgments might help, but I think that the culture of that allows that the harassment and brutality of Black people as being sort of just the cost of doing business is pretty deep seated, right? Like you would think that, say, video cameras would help, or body cameras would help, but they don't seem to, right? The officer who killed George Floyd knew he was being filmed while he suffocated him over 9 minutes. He knew that he was on camera and still did it. So I'm not sure that there are procedural fixes that will sufficiently get at what needs to be a cultural change.
Well, let me ask you a question about inequality, because actually, let's turn to Dean Martinez, because the RAND Corporation has just come out with a study that the price tag on income inequality is $50 trillion. $50 trillion that's been diverted from working Americans to the 1% since 1975. Isn't this corroding our democracy? And if we're asking how do we save the democracy, don't we have to do something about this?
I think that's right. I think that a strong democracy depends on a broad, deep middle class. And every successful democracy that you see around the world, you see a society in which the broad middle of the country is playing a central role in society, and that people from all different parts of those countries are playing a role in the middle class, that there aren't groups that are excluded from the middle class and denied the opportunity to have the kind of life that people want, where their kids can go to a good school, they can have a good job, a roof over their head, not have to worry about the basics of existence like healthcare and housing and food security. And when you don't have those things for most of the people in a society, and a fair opportunity, not just a fair opportunity, but real equality, where everyone has a meaningful ability to access those aspects of the good life, that's when you see the opportunity for more extreme political ideologies to come into play. And that democracy does depend on making sure that everyone in society can have what they need, and that no one is left out of that basic access, not just access, but the things that make that access meaningful and that allow people to succeed with their families and have the basics.
Governor, do you want to address that too?
Just simply to say I agree fully. I agree fully. As I said earlier, I don't think we can sustain it. I don't think you can have a vibrant democracy with the level of income inequality that we now have in America. And as I said before, there's no one tool in our toolbox that gets us to have a more equal distribution of wealth. It's it starts with that's childcare. That's why is it that even in this country we see such inequality in maternal fatalities on the basis of race? Our public schools. Why is it that all over America the worst public schools are filled with Black and brown poor kids? There's no one thing, as I said earlier. It's I wasn't familiar with the RAND study, and I would have to look at it to see if 50 trillion is the right number, but I believe it because we are in an utterly unsustainable place right now. Capitalism has to be rethought with different guardrails so it is sustainable and, by the way, maintained. At least that's my view. And if you want to have a democracy with, we could talk all day we talked about voting, but it's not just voting, it's all of our democratic institutions which are fraying. Not to mention people's trust in government and institutions is at an all-time low. That is rooted in this deep inequality, which breeds anger, lack of hope, despondency, and as Dean Martinez said, kind of radical ideology. So we can try to ignore it. We can try to put Band-Aids on it. But I think we need a very significant public investments in infrastructure, housing, education, job training, healthcare, to begin the process of providing a semblance of equal access to opportunity. Otherwise, our democracy is absolutely in peril. People don't trust institutions. So when you have someone like our current president who comes along and taps into that fear, who could blame them for not trusting institutions? Look at the outcome. So really have to have my greatest worry, I am hopeful. You have to be in my business. I'm very hopeful. I believe young people are really leading the way in many ways. And there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. My worry is that too many Americans don't realize too many people in power and positions of influence don't realize the magnitude of the problem and the risks that are right in front of us. And we have to take some urgent action.
Well, I personally am very concerned about the fact that we have literally hundreds of armed militias in this country, and the possibility that they will become a kind of paramilitary force. In my county, in Virginia, there are more guns than people, and we're a Second Amendment sanctuary. So there's a front line there. I'm not far from Charlottesville. And who would like to address what we do about guns and thinking about guns and democracy?
Well, I think it goes.
Go ahead, Jenny. Sorry.
I think it also goes to a question of, how our democracy is working, because polling shows that a great majority of Americans support reasonable gun control. and counter-majoritarian aspects of our legal system and our government system are thwarting common sense rules that a very large percentage of Americans support. And in that sense, the issue of guns is tied up with a lot of ways in which our democracy is thwarting reasonable people from coming together in the middle and enacting common sense measures that enjoy broad majority support.
Anybody else have an idea about guns? I mean, I think it's a very serious problem. I see it when you look at the streets in Portland and you see people with weapons who are actually treated as though it's okay to be there and take action. This seems to me, having, as a journalist, I covered the world in lots of countries that had plenty of paramilitaries. I see it as very dangerous. What about you, Professor Walker-Sterling?
Well, I agree. I do think most people I know, and as Dean Martinez just said, most people support common sense gun control. Again, for me, I'm a critical race theorist is my area, and that I study in the law, and so part of me knows that the issue of sort of self-defense and gun rights are definitely tied up in racial politics, and there's this law review article that I believe is called something like "Self-Defense is for White People," which actually just covers a lot of instances where there are similar cases where Black people were armed and white people were armed, and white people were able to successfully avail themselves of the self-defense when Black people were not, which is tied into ideas about Black criminality so this issue with respect to guns is again for me is tied up in sort of race politics, and I don't know. I think that, well, I'm just going to stop because I think I'm rambling, but I share your concern, and with militias, my biggest concern is that I don't have any protection from them, right? I can't depend on the police either. So, yeah.
All right, let me
say one quick thing on guns. I think that I agree with you, Leslie. I absolutely share the concern. I see it here in my own state. One of the executive orders that I had to sign during the COVID emergency was to give our local police officers, police chiefs, an ability to extend the waiting time from 7 days to 30 days give them more time to do a background check. The reason I did that is because when COVID hit, there was a huge rush of people to go buy guns. And so we were hearing from police chiefs, the way it works in Rhode Island is if after a certain number of days, you go ahead and get your permit. And I was hearing that, hey, Governor, there's such a backlog of people who want guns. We cannot possibly get the background check completed in 7 days. And so I extended it to 30 days over great opposition so that they could do their job properly and do the background check. So it's, to answer your question, am I worried? I'm worried. But here's what I was going to say. We can't have a panel on saving democracy without talking at least for a minute about the need for campaign finance reform. Because, Dean Martinez put her finger on it. Study after study, poll after poll, the vast majority of Americans, Democrat and Republican, are in favor of certain basic, effective, common sense gun safety legislation. But yet we can't get it passed. I've struggled here in Rhode Island mightily. It took me 3 years in a Democratic state to pass a bill that says people convicted of felony domestic violence couldn't have a gun. Hardly a fringe piece of legislation, in my view. So why is it? It's because of campaign finance. It's because the NRA fills the coffers of people. They scare them. And it's not just guns. It's so many issues. So if you were to say, how do we save our democracy? Serious campaign finance reform to get money and dark money out of politics. I don't know if you guys want to weigh.
I agree with the governor on that.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, I agree with.
Go ahead.
There's a slight lag in my video, so it's a little hard to tell who's talking. I mean, I agree with the governor completely on that it is just another example of where the middle is missing because of the skew towards the extremes, and campaign finance is another one of those areas where the broad middle of the country is being left out as very wealthy interests are able to devote large sums of money to dominating the process. And that's not what our country was built on or is about. And campaign finance reform is one example of an area in which we need reform. And I think you can look at other ways in which our democratic system of government is under extreme strain. So partisan gerrymandering to a degree that really leaves out the middle and leads to disproportion in who is serving in government compared to what the majority of people support. So I think there are a number of areas in which those types of reforms are needed to go back to something that's more functional.
Okay, I know Governor Raimondo has to go at 4:30, so let me just quickly go to questions. Do you think that mass regulation of social media is necessary to save democracy, and how so can we accomplish this? Let me ask the governor first because she's got to take off.
I am so sorry, but I couldn't hear that.
Okay. Do you think that mass regulation or revamping of social media is necessary to save democracy?
Okay. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. A huge problem is that people are receiving information and being pushed information in all sorts of insidious ways that isn't news, that isn't factual, and that is only reflective of a particular viewpoint. So the fact that if people don't really receive news, they receive some form of, propaganda or very biased, inaccurate information all day, every day, on every channel, perpetuating a certain viewpoint, really breeds, as Jenny said, this kind of radical ideologies which are not reflective of the middle. So, in fact, there's a new show out that I'm gonna one of these days find time to watch, The Social Dilemma, and it kind of talks about social media, but their ability to filter information, have it be ubiquitous, have it be so targeted to what you might be thinking in this moment and serving you up that information. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. Now, I know you're from Silicon Valley and Stanford, and that, it's certainly created a lot of jobs on the basis of that innovation, but it is out of control and undermining our democracy. And, you can talk even further about privacy. So bottom line is, absolutely, it has to be a piece of the puzzle.
So Governor, let me just say thank you for being with us. You are amazing, and we're very proud to have you as a Yale woman. Go Yale women. And then let's turn this over to you, Dean Martinez, to answer that question, since you are at Stanford, right in the middle of Silicon Valley.
Social media is a really troublesome phenomena in the exchange of ideas, because the incentives that are there for revenue by increasing the number of people who click on something are driven towards extreme ideas, not necessarily towards the most reliable information or fact-based information. And the algorithms that are used drive people towards more extreme, less reliable information. And we do need to realize this is not the old-fashioned system of newspapers and television or radio, and that we need to think about how sensibly as a society we are going to regulate this technology that is different from technologies that existed in the past, and that if we don't figure out a better way to handle it, either through legislation or voluntary steps that might be taken by the platforms, it's going to pose a serious threat to democracy. And it's only going to get worse as technology makes it easier for things like deep fakes, videos that you can't tell whether they're true or false, and really very much look like a real person saying something that they never said. And we have to get ahead of that technology problem, because it also is driving this same phenomenon that was talked about earlier, where people don't trust institutions. Well, they also don't trust the media. And when you can't trust your eyes when you see a video online, that just further leads us down a spiral of not knowing what to believe or what not to believe.
I think there needs to be a clinic at Stanford to solve this problem.
We have some. We have some, actually. We just ran a policy lab on with respect to this. So we have our students working on these issues, and they've come out with a ton of recommendations that you can find somewhere on our website.
Excellent. Okay, Professor Walker-Sterling, what do you have to say about this?
Well, I'm just going to right now defer to co-sign and defer to Dean Martinez, because I think that she's more of an expert on this with her location at Stanford. Chicago isn't right now sort of like a hotbed of, like social media innovation. So.
Okay. But we're about to wrap up. So let me ask you, Professor Walker-Sterling,
Sure.
What is an issue? When you look at what's happening right now all around you, you were talking about what's going on in Louisville. What is it that, how do you frame it in your thinking of what disturbs you the most and what really must be addressed soon to protect this democracy?
I think that the sort of procedural fix would be dealing with voting, and in particular the truth about voting, that it actually that the instance of voter fraud is actually quite low, that the voter suppression efforts which are a kind of which we should be thinking of as like actual voter fraud. It should be voter suppression efforts are sort of widespread and happening in ways that are tricking us into thinking that they're reasonable measures when they're in fact just ways to gatekeep to keep people of color and other marginalized groups to remove access to the voting box. So that's the sort of the procedural issue, and then the larger issue, as I mentioned earlier, would be that we need to have just sort of a real engagement with the truth as an important concept, and to understand exactly what our history has been and how it needs to change so that we can go forward in a way that actually lives up to the ideals that our country purports to espouse.
I second that. Dean Martinez, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think we really need to look at the basic underpinnings of democracy and do what we can to reinforce them. And that includes very much, as Professor Walker-Sterling said, addressing issues of voter suppression and making sure that everyone has access to the ballot box, that it's easy for people to participate, that their votes are counted, that they're not blocked from participation in the democratic process through voter suppression. We need common sense campaign finance reform so that the voices that are heard are the voices of the people, not of elite interests that are paying money. And we need to address issues like partisan gerrymandering that are skewing electoral districts. And we need to find a way to reckon with the counter-majoritarian aspects of our constitutional system, like the Electoral College, the structure of the Senate, the way that we have gone in appointing Supreme Court justices and the politicization of that process, that have amplified these counter-majoritarian features of our Constitution, which were put in there to try to form checks and balances and reasoned deliberation. But as things have developed over time, have led not to checks and balances, but to a real distortion of the system and to gridlock that is leading to the more and more extreme polarization that we're seeing and the undermining of the basic mechanics of democracy.
I think that wraps it up perfectly. I think I just want to say that I'm really proud to be in a panel with you two and with the governor. I'm very happy to see such acute minds dealing with these kinds of problems, and you have some very lucky students, both of you. So thank you so much for being part of this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.